All right, well, everybody, welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And I'm very happy with the guest I have tonight. We are joined by Ann Garrison, and is a frequent contributor to Black Agenda Reports, which is news, commentary, and analysis from a Black left perspective. And we're going to be talking, and it's Black History Month, so we're going to be talking about some of the state of affairs that's going on in the content of Africa. Anne, who is a superb independent journalist and radio show host, her superb body of work has helped people understand what is happening in Eastern Congo, the suppressed truth around Rwandan strongman Paul Kagame and his role in the and his role, of course, in the murder of the Rwandan Burundian presence that led to the Rwandan genocide, followed by the Congo crisis and the war in Eastern Congo. And from Burundi to Syria to debunking anti-Russia conspiracy theories, and is a brilliant indie journalist, media critic, and geocritic. And she's with us today. So, Ms. Garrison, first of all, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks.
And Ms. Garrison, before we get to the topics, I actually just finished reading the Black Agenda by your comrade, the late Glen, who was the executive editor of Black Agenda Reports. And because it is Black History Month, please, can you share with us any thoughts about the legacy of not just the late great Glen, but also Bruce Dixon, co-founder and a frequent contributor to Black Agenda Report, before we get to the topics I want to talk to you about today.
Okay, well, I feel like telling you a little story about my experience with them. I love both Bruce Dixon and Glen so much that I have two trees outside my house, and I named one of them Bruce and one of them Glen, so that I would always look at those trees and think of them and think I had to carry on all the great work that they did. There was something I had been wanting to ask Bruce after I had written for the Black Agenda Report for quite a few years. And I finally did. I said, Bruce, could I be an honorary Negro? and he said, I'll put it to the board, but after that, it's out of my hands. And then when I told the Jamu Baraka that, he said, well, that's okay, but you have to be an African. We've got enough Negroes as it is.
That is a wonderful story.
Glenn was amused by that, and it certainly made me feel very much accepted. This may sound like an odd thing to say, but they never held my skin color against me. They thought that my writing about Africa was incisive, and so they made me a contributing editor, one of the greatest honors I've ever received. Bruce was the most knowledgeable person I've ever met about electoral politics. He worked for the Chicago Board of Elections and was there at the time of Howard Washington, who was a Black mayor of Chicago who gave people a lot of promise, and then shortly after being elected, died of a heart attack.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, well, that was way back, I think, in the 60s or 70s. Okay. And sometimes I would ask Bruce, why do we keep bothering with electoral politics? It's just a disaster. Representative democracy is a disaster. Shouldn't all these resources that go into electoral politics go into community projects like building community gardens? And he said, well, every community garden that I ever knew about got bulldozed by city authorities. So you have to have political power.
Yeah.
And he and I were both members of the Green Party. So which is the only radical, well, I shouldn't say that. It's the only radical party. Yeah, in the US, it's the only radical party that has achieved a lot of ballot access. We don't have ballot access in all 50 states, but we have enough ballot access to play a significant role. And of course, we're always being blamed for being the 1% that would have voted for the Democrat and therefore elected George Bush, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But Bruce had ideas about how the party should be organized, which were good ideas, which were good, my roommate, which were good ideas, are good ideas in general about organizations and leadership, and how organizations and leadership have to be in touch. The members of an organization have to always be on top of what their leaders are doing, and they have to have the right to pull them back if they're not doing the people's will. Now, of course, in elections, you have to wait, for the House of Representatives here, you have to wait every 2 years, and senators 6. So you can't do that quite as immediately as you might do within the Green Party, but still it's an idea about how organizations work. And I saw him should work.
Yeah.
Actually, if you've read a bit about the Spanish anarchists during the Spanish Civil War, they had developed that kind of relationship between membership and leadership. That's one of the best things I got from Bruce, aside from the fact that he had a hilarious sense of humor. Glen was just brilliant and the most incisive political analyst I've ever known. He was, of course, particularly incisive and can't think of the right word for it, but he criticized the Black misleadership class.
Exactly.
Actually, he and Glen and Margaret all did that. And that became one of the defining hallmarks of Black Agenda Report. In fact, I have to finish a piece today for this week's bar, which is about a police chief here where I live in the Bay Area, in a suburb of the Bay Area called Antioch. They had the first Black police chief a while back, and he moved on to become the first Black police chief in Boise, Idaho. Do you know if in Europe?
Yeah.
Actually, that makes sense to you? Yeah, it's one of the larger cities in the Northwest, but I think there may be 300,000 people in Boise. So that was a move up from Antioch, which is a smaller exurb. But a friend of mine and several other people were arrested demonstrating when the Back of the Blue Antioch group threw a going away party for him. And they were there to make the point that he had not been a great police chief, despite being the first Black police chief of Antioch. And Frank is now charged with resisting arrest. And the police tackled him. He's charged with resisting arrest. And that's, like a very local version of the kind of Black misleadership politics that Bruce and Glen both criticized, and Margaret. Glen was also brilliant about the war on terror.
Yeah.
And I remember him saying that the most shocking fact, this isn't word for word, but that Americans should face and are still quite unable to face, is that the US has been funding terrorists around the world to fuel the war on terror, most notably in Syria, where, Tulsi Gabbard, a House rep from Hawaii here, actually introduced some legislation called the Stop Funding Terrorists Act.
Yeah. Which would have ended both the Western Gulf War on Yemen as well as the Western Gulf War on Syria. Would have been able to have killed 2 birds with 1 stone. Yeah.
Yes, and of course we have to remember that the U.S. funded the Mujahideen and Osama bin Laden.
Yeah.
I don't know how well that worked out. So that's just one of the things that Glen was brilliant about. Sometimes I do these stories like the one I was telling you about the Antioch police chief, the first Black police chief. And he used to do that kind of thing. At the beginning of his career, he was working at a radio station in Augusta, Georgia, which is a mid-sized majority Black town. And he said that when he first came, there was a list of contacts on the wall, and they were all Baptist this and Reverend that.
Yeah.
The theocracy was disgusted, so he tore him off the wall, and he went out and found the most vocal person in the housing projects, the most vocal person in the schools, the most vocal person about police brutality. And he gave them a microphone and encouraged them, and they really blossomed. So sometimes he would say to me that because I write about things like this, and he's usually at the upper levels of analysis, it made him nostalgic about when he used to do that kind of thing all the time. And there are, a million other things I could say about Glen, but maybe you want to move on.
May both he and Bruce rest in power. I would have loved to have met. I would have loved to have met both of them in person, and that's also one of my favorite stories. That Glen would say to people who interviewed him, that he ripped off all of father this all of those because he called them accommodationist priests who would shield Martin Luther King Jr. from coming to places like Augusta, Georgia. So he was always onto the Black misleadership class before it even became a term that all of you at Black Agenda Report, coined and spoke out. And that's why people need to get this book, The Black Agenda. It's a great collection of articles and each one about each one where he really hammers the Obama legacy is just stupendous. It's just stupendous. And I only hope that a similar book could be made of Bruce's great collections. And so I encourage everyone to get this book, and of course to donate generously to yours truly, blackagendareport.com.
Thank you. I've learned so much from the editors of Black Agenda Report. I mean, I've certainly been given, I'd say, more than I've given myself. And I didn't know that, I wasn't old enough to know this, but that the Black clergy was largely conservative, and that they had discouraged rather than supporting Dr. Martin Luther King at first. It was a minority that was with him.
Yeah, that's shocking. That's shocking. But then the more you start to dig into, the Black misleadership class, the more it all makes, perfect sense. Especially with Paul Robeson being thrown, Paul Robeson being thrown under the bus, and of course many of them not, the NAACP and all those organizations saying to Martin Luther King Jr., do you really have to speak out against Vietnam? Like, come on, Johnson just gave us, the civil rights.
This is just kind of free association, but I was remembering a similar story because of what's been happening in Burkina Faso and West Africa, the French trying to maintain their neo-colonial grip.
Yeah.
And the African Union is meeting right now, or I guess it's probably over. It's just the weekend, right?
Yeah.
And when it started, I kept thinking, geez, I just can't wait for somebody to stand up and say, we should all default on the debt. Why don't we all collectively default on the debt, which just drains Africa dry?
Yeah.
But the last time anyone said that was Thomas Sankara, and he was dead within a year. Similarly, when Dr. King said we needed to end the Vietnam War, and what was he said? I can't remember the quotation, but that the United States, it's the war on poverty. Johnson's war on poverty would never go anywhere as long as all of the U.S. resources were going into the war in Vietnam. So there are two great Black leaders who said what was taboo and died within a year.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. And the injustices, when it comes to Africa, still continue. And and then we see, when somebody does really, hammer it to the empire, like Julian Assange,
Oh, yeah.
the whole full ways of the establishment, and of course the enemies, within our people power movements are ready to just throw them under the bus or even participate in their demise, and it's just unbelievable.
Yeah.
And that's a perfect segue then to what's going on in Ethiopia. Now, before 1 moment. Now before we talk about the current conflict that's going on with the Tigrayan people, can you share any knowledge that you may have on Ethiopia when it was ruled by Haile Selassie and the pros and cons of that? Or
I'm not a scholar about that. I can tell you there was an essay by Marcus Garvey that the Black Agenda Report published to give some historical perspective on this shortly after the conflict started, or maybe it was 6 months in, but Marcus Garvey was not a fan of Selassie. And
interesting.
Marcus Garvey wrote that Selassie did not consider himself Black.
Okay.
And that he was very involved in the oppression of the southern peoples of Ethiopia, most of whom are darker skinned. I mean, I gotta say, this is, I hope I'm not going to get into too sensitive ground here, but a lot of the Ethiopians that I know from northern Ethiopia, even Eritrea, if they told me that they were Arabs, I wouldn't question it. When people become so mixed, they could claim one or the other, whichever they identify with. I mean, Glen Ford probably could have passed for white if he wanted to. Obviously, that was the very last thing he wanted to do. That's what Garvey said about Selassie. I can't think right off of anything. Of course, he's a hero. He's a hero for resisting colonialism, and especially to the Rastafarians.
Exactly.
Okay, and I don't think that that formulation is really invalid. There's a great scholar who wrote a book about it. Horace Campbell wrote a book about the Rastafarians and how they had conceived Selassie as the Black Prophet, as whatever its relationship to fact, it was a liberation theology kind of. Well, theology is kind of a fancy word. It's a ghetto religion, but it was a liberation, a religion of liberation. But
they overlooked. But they overlooked
yeah,
the fact that
they overlooked a few things. Well, I'll tell you something else. No, I can't. No, this is kind of off topic. This is kind of wonderful. The Rastafarians believe that the burning bush in the Bible was cannabis.
Yes. Yeah.
And in fact, since learning that, I've learned that the ritual use of cannabis or hashish is traditional in the Eastern Orthodox Church, in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. No, wait, I'm going to get this wrong. Tawada. There are various names for the sects of the Ethiopian Church. I mean, the Orthodox Church.
Yeah.
Actually are all over the world, and I can't always keep them right. So that's about all I have to say about Haile Selassie. Like I said, I'm no expert.
Okay, well that's that's very interesting. And then before we get then to current affairs, because I think it's safe, because I know I saw some documentaries that Fame's TV in Britain did on Ethiopia when when the huge famine broke out, and when Selassie was later overthrown by a Marxist group called the Derg. And when you watch that documentary, it's funny because I saw a documentary that that Chinese media did on Selassie, which depicted him as this great pan Africanist and so forth. Of course, a war hero, a hero in World War II. And then when you watch that, and then you compare and contrast it to what what these British left wing journalists did, you think to yourself, wow, Selassie was pretty sectarian, and you could almost sort of compare the conditions to when the Russian revolution broke out and overthrew the Tsars. So,
well, I mean, yeah, emperors are emperors. Empire is not usually a nice thing. It's
exactly
usually created of violence and extreme hierarchy.
It's but I think for too many of us, we probably just completely overlook that about Selassie because of popular culture, popular Black culture, reggae culture, and the Rastafarian movements. But,
well, and there were African Americans were lining up to go volunteer in Ethiopia during the Italian occupation, especially in Harlem, in the center of New York City. And most of them were prevented from going by somehow the State Department came up with some technical something or other. Maybe it was that they couldn't go fight under a foreign command, something like that.
Kind of like in Canada. They passed a law like that, which barred basically the broad Canadian left from participating in the Spanish Republic, fighting off the the fascists.
Yeah. I have sensed since I started coming in contact with this story that there is a lot of tension about Ethiopia's history as an empire. Particularly, I sense it as a conflict between the Oromo and the Amhara. I think probably also the Tigrayan, although sort of at the moment, extremists in the Oromo ethnicity, the Oromo Liberation Army or something, OLA or Front, seem to have made some sort of alliance with the TPLF. But in large part, many Oromos see themselves as a historically oppressed group. And then the Southern nationalities and the people of Gambela were also conquered. Someone told me, I'll tell you this anyway. I have a little hesitation, but I'm going to tell you this anyway. The Amhara, many of them do idealize their former rulers. I can't even remember whether Selassie was Tigrayan or Amhara, but Menelik was the great Amhara emperor who seems to be particularly revered. And he also is revered because he led the defeat of the Italians at the Battle of Adwa.
Yeah.
But someone who is Amhara told me that Menelik had been very smart because he had seen that there was all this fertile farmland in southwest, I'm forgetting the name of it, in southwest Ethiopia, and he had stolen that, basically. No, he had taken that and in some previous conflict and given Sudan a bunch of desert. So he was very smart, to have made that decision. And Gambela, that's the region. And the same person told me that Menelik had forced the people of Gambela to become Christians, as though that were not an extremely violent act. I think it's an extremely violent act.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's an attempt to transform the one's deepest beliefs and being. They were animist. Okay, so, and I'm sure that happened also with the Southern nationalities. I don't know very much about the Southern nationalities, but there is a province where many languages are spoken. There are many languages and cultures that are closest to what we consider indigenous culture, who are in this province called the Southern nationalities.
Wow, that's fascinating. And is there any knowledge that you can share with us about when the Derg took over from Selassie in a coup? Is there any knowledge you can give to us about that? About their reign over Ethiopia?
Again, if we can call it scholarship, is mostly about what's happened since November 3rd, 2020, when the TPLF attacked a federal army base and started the war. I have asked people whether there was anything populist about this ruling junta that called itself Marxist-Leninist, as did the TPLF for a while, until the fall of the Soviet Union. They were no longer Marxist-Leninist after the fall of the Soviet Union. And one thing I read that was really interesting in Mohammed Abdullahi, his book, that's Farmajo for short. He is the president of Somalia. And he said that over and over again, Western forms that weren't native or natural to the indigenous culture were forced on the African nations in this region. And one of them was Marxism, Leninism, and they would flip-flop back and forth. So that's about all I can tell you is that no one I know has defended the Derg to me.
Okay.
I saw one person doing that once on social media, but honestly, I don't know. There's probably, I'm sure there are stories there, and some might even be sympathetic to what the Derg tried to accomplish. They did oust an emperor, and I think it might have been the Derg who nationalized all the land. But now I'm really getting into what either the Derg or the TPLF nationalized all the land in Ethiopia, and that might sound great, but it's a great idea in theory, but I don't think it worked out so well.
Yeah, exactly. A great idea, but in practice, and of course, that's where we get to towards towards Live Aid, and do they know it's Christmas time? Of course, they know it's Christmas time over there. They are Orthodox, and of course, all that stuff. And there's some interesting.
They celebrate Christmas on, I believe it's the 17th. Of January, excuse me. They celebrate Christmas several weeks into January. And this year, Abiy Ahmed did something I thought was just brilliant. He called on all Ethiopians to come home, in the diaspora, to come home, called it the Great Homecoming at Christmas, which for them is, I think it's January 17th. And anyway, in any case, it's a couple of weeks into January. And many did. The airlines were booked for quite a while. At that point, I'll say I was thinking Abiy Ahmed was just a brilliant politician, because first he had said he was finally going to the front. And it was when he went to the front that the tide turned and they started driving the TPLF back. Before then, there had been constant reports every day in the media that Addis Ababa was about to fall, the TPLF were advancing, and the US and European governments were urging all their citizens to get out as fast as they could, and even offering to pay their fare. And I knew some, and in various webinars of the Ethiopian community that I know, they would get a hold of people over there who would say, "It's fine, Addis is peaceful. This is all a hoax." It seemed almost like, well, if we will it to be true, it will. But then Abiy went to the front, the tide started to turn, and then it was shortly after that that he called for the Great Ethiopian Homecoming, and many went home. What happened after that suddenly upset a lot of people, and I think people are still trying to understand it. He released some political prisoners that people thought were very dangerous. And that was a political move that confused and angered a lot of people. And I myself don't, I can't say I know what to make of it. But at this point, there seems to be a lot of maneuvering going on behind the scenes that we aren't going to know about for a little while. Of course, the war has cost enormously. You have to ask how long. I assume that the TPLF are getting some kind of support from the West, because here they are in an enclave. They're surrounded by Eritrea, Amhara, no access, no access to Sudan. And so once you start a war, you have to be resupplied with munitions and food. Now, it seems clear that they've been stealing the food sent in by the World Food Program trucks. I wrote a piece. It was actually one of the most fun pieces I've ever written. It was called Ethiopia, the Case of the Disappearing 428 Food Trucks. This was just absolutely inexplicable. And now it's like more than 1,000 food trucks. The narrative has been Abiy Ahmed is starving Tigray.
Yeah.
And he won't let the aid in, he won't let the food trucks in. Well, but a BBC article sort of broke through and said, hey, at the point when it was 428 trucks, hey, 428 of those trucks just disappeared into Tigray. After that, the press stopped talking about it. Although
let's actually go back a bit. Let's actually,
you need to go back. I was getting off track. They have to get munitions. Let me just. They have to be getting munitions. So someone has to be supplying them one way or another, whether they're smuggled in, or whether they're in aid convoys, or they're airlifted somehow. And that would mean penetrating Ethiopian airspace. And I asked a bit about that, and it seems like there is a slight possibility of that. But how long can the Ethiopian government sustain the war effort? It's been very costly and painful. So let's
actually rewind a bit, and yeah, so let's actually rewind a bit and talk about the Tigrayan conflict, which you were talking about. Now, anyone who watches BBC News or other reputable European news, and then CNN or recent New York Times and so forth, they explain the conflict as they explain the Tigrayan conflict as Ethiopia is waging a genocidal war against the people who should be who should become a new African country. And in left-leaning indie news, or otherwise, supposedly independent left news, the once Nobel Prize-winning Ethiopian president is suppressing a very revolutionary left-leaning movement with legitimate grievances. So please tell us, what is this all about, and help us really understand what is happening, and why should a left-leaning anti-imperialist audience be opposed to global states sanctioning Ethiopia and not demanding that the Tigrayans secede from Ethiopia?
Well, first, wow, you say your left independent press there in Belgium and in Europe is agreeing with this argument about Tigray genocide, is accepting that?
Yeah, more or less. If you watch BBC News or just any other European news, it's Ethiopia is evil, the Tigrayans are good, the Tigrayans, like the Kurds, they should be allowed to have their own independent country. That's basically, in a nutshell, how everyone basically is understanding the current conflicts happening in Ethiopia. And that's, once upon a time, Mr. Nice, Nobel Peace Prize winning Ethiopian president is now has now fallen from fallen from grace.
Well, there have been two narratives supporting U.S. and Western NATO military intervention since 9/11, and the first was the war on terror, and that dominated for a long time. Around first year or two of Obama's presidency, he issued something called the Presidential Directive on Stopping Mass Atrocities. That might not be word for word, but that document said, now it's been X years since the Holocaust and Y years since the Rwandan genocide. We must all honor our responsibility to protect the vulnerable. And that became the rationale for further interventions in Libya and Syria. And one interesting thing about that is Rwanda is always invoked. And not only did Rwandans suffer what they suffered, thanks to a lot of engineering by the West that most people don't understand, now they're used as an excuse for starting further wars.
Exactly.
As soon as officials and press start invoking Rwanda, say, not since Rwanda have there been such refugee flows, there's a humanitarian interventionist argument being developed. Unfortunately, some of the pillars of the left press here have fallen for that. I think most notably and sadly, Amy Goodman of Democracy Now! That became very noteworthy during the Libyan war, the NATO war in Libya. That was immediately we started hearing the word genocide. And I don't know of any evidence. Well, I don't know of anyone defending the Libyan war these days. Even Samantha Power. I mean, look, how could anything have been going on then that was worse than what we created?
In fact, Amnesty International, which was recycling the Gaddafi is giving Viagra to African mercenaries and so forth to commit mass rape. Amnesty International later had to get rid of that storyline and say, "Oh no, we actually didn't find any evidence." And many Norwegian NGOs and so forth, which all went along with the they all take that back.
Yeah, so that was a stopping genocide war, and the press started saying, we're obliged because of what we let happen in Rwanda. In fact, after the end of the Libyan war, after Hillary Clinton said, we saw, he died, and American oil companies moved into Libya, even amidst the chaos, American oil companies have reestablished themselves. after that, Susan Rice flew into Libya to celebrate, and then, bolstering this propaganda narrative, she immediately flew to Rwanda, or she got off the plane and said, "We got it right this time in Libya."
Wow.
Yeah. It is, it's a difficult argument to deal with, because who isn't opposed to stopping genocide and mass atrocities? Who doesn't want to stop genocide and mass atrocities? So when people start telling you horrible stories and you're not sure who to believe, well, it's hard for a lot of people not to believe it and think, okay, we should stop genocide and mass atrocities. And one example is the issue of sexual violence. There is horrific sexual violence that goes on in wars, not just against women, but also against men. And because I have written a lot about Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, I know the work of Dr. Denis Mukwege, the man who heals women, who won the Nobel Prize deservedly. Like no one but Martin Luther King ever deserved the Nobel Prize more than he did. And his work to heal women horrifically injured by sexual violence is awesome. But at the same time, you have sexual violence fabricated and used as an excuse, like with the Viagra story. And there's evidence of that happening in Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, women who were working in the relief operations said that suddenly the press started asking them all the time about sexual violence and how much sexual violence, how bad was it? They were sensationalizing, and they were being pushed to sensationalize the issue. And then some UN officials showed up and wanted them to come up with statistics. And they were saying, we're not an investigative agency. We are a relief agency. We provide services. And then they had a meeting in which it was a Zoom meeting of the UN country team in Ethiopia. And they discussed that this was happening and asked one another whether they could come up with a common stance about it so they wouldn't be issuing contradictory statements. But they basically couldn't agree. And one person was basically saying, how can you question anyone who said that they're a victim of sexual violence? And the staff were saying, of course we're compassionate. That's what we do. That's what we're about. Compassion for these victims. But all we have is anecdotal evidence. We can't tell you how many women have been raped in Tigray or in the neighboring provinces. And we don't like being pushed to come up with facts that don't exist, facts and numbers that don't exist, and to sensationalize it. There was eventually an Ethiopian and UN human rights team that went in and did an investigation following the sort of rules that are established for that type of investigation. And they concluded that there was no genocide. There was no evidence of genocide. And okay. There was sexual violence, but it couldn't all be blamed on the Ethiopian National Defense Force.
So what? So then what are the? How can I frame this question? So then, why is the West then interested in seeing seeing Tigray secede from Ethiopia? Like, what is it about the current president of Ethiopia, which the West all of a sudden says, why the West all of a sudden wants to see yet another African country, destabilized and and all that. Like, what? Yeah. So in other words, why is the West interested in Tigray seceding from Ethiopia and possibly even overthrowing the current president of Ethiopia? Then
I think it's pretty clear they're not going to be able to overthrow the current president, even if they had that ambition for a while. I think, for one, it's that they lost their puppet. And Meles Zenawi had pretty close personal relationships with people who were in power during the previous administrations, but they lost their puppet. And they also see independence emerging in the Horn. And shortly after being placed in power, after there was an uprising that displaced the TPLF, I think it was largely Oromo, and Abiy came to power for several years before he was elected last year in a landslide. And he almost immediately negotiated peace with Eritrea. And Ethiopia and Eritrea had been engaged in a border war, sometimes literally declared, sometimes de facto, for maybe 15 or more years.
And Eritrea used to be, if I'm not mistaken, Eritrea used to be a part of Ethiopia, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but it had fought for its independence for many decades before it finally won it. And now I'm forgetting whether it's 1991 or 1993. 1991 is when the TPLF came to power. I mean, not the TPLF. Yeah, 1991 is when the TPLF led the alliance that defeated the Derg. And then they were so much more militarily powerful that they came to dominate the coalition, which essentially became an ethnic dictatorship. And shortly thereafter, this border conflict started, went on for decades, and an international body even ruled on the border and said that Eritrea was right. And Ethiopia, the TPLF refused to accept that. Here's the important thing to understand about that. It was not a war between Ethiopia and Eritrea. What happened after Abiy became prime minister, is it became apparent that had been a war between the TPLF and Eritrea.
Fascinating. Okay.
Yeah, and Eritrea, so far as I can tell, Eritreans and Ethiopians have been very bonded since then in their opposition to the TPLF. So now, where were we there?
So
coming back, the freewheeling conversation, it's easy to get lost, but okay, it had been a war between the TPLF.
Yeah, so
asking about Eritrea's independence. Yeah, they had, at one point, the US was dividing things up and sort of gave Eritrea to Ethiopia. Eritrea never accepted that. I mean, you have a lot of colonial boundaries and people pushing against colonial boundaries or either arguing to accept them. There was the Cairo Declaration, I think, where African nations agreed that they were going to accept the colonial boundaries, that they couldn't be withdrawn or redrawn very successfully. So there were various periods of colonialism in which Eritrea was not independent. It was not part of Ethiopia, and it was an Italian colony.
Yeah.
And then there was this period that the US arranged in which it was absorbed into Ethiopia. And then it kept fighting for its independence. One interesting thing is that Eritrea and Tigray speak the same language, in large part.
Okay, interesting.
Eritrea speak Tigrinya, it's called, and many other languages. There are many languages spoken in Eritrea, and most of the countries in the Horn seem to have 2 or 3 official languages. Often, and I see this throughout Africa, they'll have a language of business, which is one of the European languages. It's interesting also that, this is way off track, but in the stands, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, all that, they're typically Russian is the language of business.
Mm-hmm. So and it's okay. So the current president of Ethiopia, so he finally manages to make peace with Eritrea. And what specific policy is he doing that's making the West upset? So therefore, they have to do the typical divide and conquer, which is supporting the TPLF that's trying to secede from Ethiopia.
Well, the Ethiopian Prime Minister, the Eritrean President, and the Somali President, Abdullahi Farmajo, they, Isaias Afwerki in Eritrea, they met and signed a tripartite agreement to cooperate regionally in a number of ways. And the sight of that kind of collaboration and independence emerging in the Horn of Africa was just more than the US could tolerate.
Because it's very Pan-Africanist, and also it's I mean, the West, France, much of Europe, and the US, and of course Canada as well, they benefit from instability in Africa, instability in the Middle East. So therefore, this is why all of a sudden we're hearing Ethiopia oppressive government, and we need to give independence to Tigray. Is that it?
Right. And there's also Eritrea. I mean, there is also the competition with China, and then there's Eritrea, an economic model that the Western oligarchs don't like. Samantha Power actually said that she would use USAID to fight China in Africa. That's what she told Congress at her confirmation hearing. Sometimes I think these people, it's American foreign policy so stupid. I'm thinking that as Blinken, Biden, etc., they must all own stock in big Chinese companies, because policy just pushes Africans into the arms of China. And that is what has been happening in Eritrea and Ethiopia since all this started. But Eritrea is a different economic model. Some call it the Cuba of Africa. And I'm just beginning to learn about it. One thing I learned most recently is that Eritrea, despite being an arid climate on the Red Sea, has become essentially food secure using innovative farming techniques. And food security is one of the biggest issues in Africa. And, the typical model is people have come in and destroyed whatever, colonists have come in, destroyed the local economy, planted everything for export, and left the people hungry.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. It has also met the Millennium Development Goals, the UN's Millennium Development Goals for health and education. And I believe it's the only African country that did make those kind of advances. And it did that even when they were heavily sanctioned.
Eritrea, we're talking about.
Eritrea, yeah. And so I'm sure that it gives the oligarchs chills to see Ethiopia, Somalia, and Eritrea forming this kind of alliance.
Okay, interesting. And so it is safe to say then that that this is just intolerable. Ethiopia making peace not just with Eritrea but with Somalia, because we know historically, which is probably a subject that we'll get into another day. But we know that historically Ethiopia was in conflict with Somalia, in conflict with Eritrea. But as you said, it was never even officially the government. It was always the TP.
TPLF, yeah. Well, the U.S. persuaded the TPLF to invade Somalia in 2006, and Somalia's seen nothing but violence and chaos and drone bombing since. I admire Abdullahi Mohammed Abdullahi. I read his master's thesis and some of his history. And he seems to me like a very modest, idealistic man. And how anybody can hold out as the president of Somalia, I mean, that in itself awes me. But, these three leaders, Isaias Afwerki, Mohammed Abdullahi Mohammed, and Abiy Ahmed, they're not your typical African kleptocrats who've been put in power by
the West.
Former colonial powers, and former colonial powers typically overthrow, defeat any kind of populist energy in government, and install kleptocrats who will do what they say for their own share of the take. And you see that all over Africa. And here you have a block of countries in a very geostrategic part of the world, emerging with some independence and without that kind of corruption, with some actual commitment to their people. And I have been thinking that it's a threat like the Bolivarian Revolution in Latin America. It's, of course, it's not exactly the same. Africa and that part of the Horn of Africa, especially Ethiopia. Not really Somalia, as I understand it. Not so much Eritrea, but Ethiopia has this huge challenge with ethnic conflict. People speaking 80 languages and having that many cultural traditions, and land conflicts.
Yeah,
I don't hear about that being one of the biggest challenges of the Bolivarian Revolution. But what's similar is that there's a block of countries who seem to have some commitment to the well-being of their people, emerging and expressing some independence and forming alliances with one another. And that the United States will never get off of Venezuela's neck. Uruguay has succumbed, at least for now. Bolivia, what happened in Bolivia, they sort of went back and forth to where it seems like the people are back in control in Bolivia for now. But Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua are the three countries that the US has sanctioned in Latin America. Oh, also Haiti. I don't know why they have Haiti sanctioned, but I mean,
but Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba are the ones who do forcefully stand up to the Western bully. So therefore, they're the axis of evil in the eyes of the U.S. and its allies.
Well, sometimes sanctions are on individuals, and then there are sanctions that punish entire populations, like
collective punishment. Yeah,
collective punishment. The U.S. always says that they're just targeting the bad guys, but in Ethiopia, they've just canceled AGOA, the trade act, which enabled manufacturing in Ethiopia to import into the United States tariff-free. And after they did that, Bill Clinton signed that out, Ethiopian exports went from $28 million a year to 300 some. And so a lot of people, particularly poor women, are losing their jobs because of this. One thing about this story is that when you think of poor women working in garment manufactories, it's almost natural to think of states of extreme exploitation. Mm-hmm. From what I can tell, that has not been that bad. The government built these industrial parks, which have, for example, facilities like sanitation, and the roof isn't going to collapse on them while they're working.
Yeah,
that kind of thing. So what drives the question was what is driving the US crazy? I think it's independence, the success of China, and the example of Eritrea.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. And that's a perfect segue to this, which is if Western pressure was to succeed on Ethiopia and Tigray was to become its own country like South Sudan, will we see another devastating catastrophe catastrophe where once again the Western do-gooders have gone it wrong, but a bunch of NGOs will just come and swoop in to this new country of Tigray, should that ever happen?
I don't know about that, but the goal that I've heard, the US goal that I have been hearing now that it's clear that the TPLF is not going to defeat the government in Addis, and the Ethiopian people aren't going to tolerate the return of the TPLF to power, is that there will be two power centers. I don't know whether actual secession is on the table or is something that the US wants to see, but two power centers, which would, of course, weaken the Ethiopian government. This attempt to break up states everywhere into smaller states, it makes it impossible for them to negotiate from strength. A nation with everything that Ethiopia has, and a union like that of Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somalia, can negotiate from strength about whatever it has to deal with the former colonial powers about, or Russia or China. There's an attempt now that I produced a little radio report about this weekend to split Somaliland off from Somalia. Last week, it came out that Somaliland had offered the use of its coast, an airport, something else I'm not thinking about, but they had offered them the use of their coast and an airport and their territorial waters to the US military. And the US military is already in Djibouti. There's some strange existence going on in Djibouti where
all of this being part of
the colonial powers plus Russia and China all have military bases there. I'd love to talk to somebody at some point who understands that. But the thing about Somaliland offering all this coast is that no state within a nation has the right to negotiate with a foreign power and offering it any sort of national resource. And that seems to be what Somaliland has done. And they did it, according to reports, because they want to be independent. They want to secede. And they think they can get the US on their side by offering to let it come in and turn their coast into a military base. And that coast is the most geostrategic coast in Somalia. If it is given up, then the rest of Somalia is kind of hanging out there on the edge on the Indian Ocean. But that's the coast that is at the mouth of the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and the Gulf of Aden, across the Gulf of Aden from Yemen and the Arabian subcontinent, Gulf of Hormuz. So I'm sure the US would love to turn the whole thing into a military base.
All part of Africa, all part of Africa, right. And the ongoing scramble for Africa then.
Right. And there was another little episode that happened with that last week, which was that Taiwan, which the US, of course, is always championing as the independent nation of China, showed up in Somaliland with 150,000 doses of coronavirus vaccine.
Okay.
And in the article it said, Reuters. Okay, it was Reuters. Reuters said that the officials who arrived with these 150,000 doses of coronavirus vaccine met with the de facto ambassador. Now, an ambassador is an ambassador to a nation, not to a state within a nation. Now, something that has Ethiopians upset now is a rumor. I don't want to say that it's true because I haven't seen official confirmation of this, but there's some kind of rumor floating around that Abiy Ahmed increased the status of the Ethiopian consul in Somaliland to ambassador. Now, if he did that, that would also be like equivalent to recognizing Somaliland as a state. But there's no official statement out there by the government to that effect. So all I can say is it's got people uneasy, but it really sounds very unlikely to me. But if he did that, that would threaten the whole tripartite alliance between Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somalia.
Yeah, and now that would be a mistake on his part because then whatever state could be like, well, we then recognize the independence of the Tigrayans and the TPLF as this Guaido type of government, right?
And we can balkanize the whole Horn.
Exactly, and that's the perfect segue then to this question, which is before I get to this, can you actually share with us any knowledge you have about Somalia, because Somalia is quite a fascinating one, because the very easy story about Somalia is that it's a chaotic anarchist place. The U.S. tried to help them out, but then their helicopter got shot with Black Hawk Down, and the U.S. says we are never helping another African nation out again. And then eventually, some radical Muslims, took over Somalia, and then the U.S. intervened. But Somalia is still a basket case since then. What can you tell us about Somalia and how that's connected to? Well, you already explained how that is connected to this new alliance that Ethiopia is trying to do with Eritrea and Somalia. But what can you tell us about Somalia?
Well, again, I'm not an expert, but I can tell you a few things. One is that first about the Black Hawk Down incident. After that, I think when some U.S. soldiers were killed and dragged through the streets in Mogadishu. Yeah. That was so upsetting that the U.S. has ever since been unwilling to commit U.S. troops to Africa in anything but an advisory capacity. However, I think that's really what Western wars are going to look like from now on. I don't think we're going to have another Afghanistan with huge troop commitments.
Yeah.
We'll see things like sanctions, other forms of economic strangulation.
War by proxy then?
Proxy war. Yeah. So in 2006, the US started a proxy war, persuaded the TPLF to invade Somalia. I'm not sure why they wanted to do that. There was a system that had become stable, that had offered people more stability than had been there for a long time, called the Islamic courts. And it was not extreme fundamentalist Islam.
Okay, interesting. Okay, yeah, go on.
Yeah, and I don't know exactly what they were doing that made the U.S. want to overthrow them, except that the whole horn is so geostrategic. So they got the TPLF to send in the Ethiopian army to overthrow the Islamic courts, and there's been constant violence and US drone bombing against al-Shabaab ever since.
And Kenya has also been doing some of the dirty work for the US, hence why like, Somali, terrorists have attacked Kenya at times.
Yeah. I shouldn't say too much more about that because
no problem.
Really don't know too much about it. Well, I talked to somebody, there's a scholar, let me recommend a scholar who's really good about Somalia, Abdi Samatar, Samatar. And I read something he wrote recently in which he said that during the period when colonialists were being overthrown, the government that emerged in Somalia was perhaps the most democratic and most committed to the people on the African continent.
What decade was that?
Let's see. Well, that was going on. I believe that the African liberation movements, liberation from colonialism, were going on during the 60s and 70s, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And but somehow, the dark forces emerged, but it was very promising at the beginning. Now, what I don't know is how it got to the point of there's chaos, and then the Islamic courts, and then the TPLF proxy war. They created the chaos. Now, there was a lot of Cold War jockeying going on.
I was just about to say that if my memory serves me correct, I remember watching a series of documentaries on the Cold War when we had to study that in high school, and I think because the U.S. saw because the U.S. saw that the Derg was not going to be their puppets, and because the Derg sort of aligned itself with the Soviet Union, the U.S. then had Somalia be its sort of proxy against whatever conflicts they had with Ethiopia. So,
well, this is a period where, as Abdullahi wrote in his very interesting master's thesis, actually that master's thesis is called U.S. Interests in Somalia from such year to such year. And you might think that was going to be a really imperialist document, but it's not. He completed that at a university in New York State here. He said that was a period where these Western political forms kept being imposed on African societies where they weren't really native.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for clarifying that. I really appreciate it. And then I have to ask you this question, which is, what's happening? What's the latest that's happening in my mother's country of the Congo, formerly Zaire? I know that Kabila has been out. Who is ruling the Congo? What action is the current government doing if any, on Rwandan troops or Rwandan Ugandan proxies in Kivu, and actually answer that before I ask the second to last question about Mr. Kagame.
Oh, Rwandan troops are U.S. and EU proxies all over the continent. Most recently, they're in Mozambique.
So Paul Kagame is the Grand Sheriff of the Western Africa then.
Well, Museveni has served that purpose too. At one point, Museveni was put in charge in Somalia. That was actually the first time Mohammed Abdullahi Mohammed went back in Somalia. He became very popular because he wasn't corrupt and he was an administrator who tried to make sure that the government sort of functioned and government employees got paid. He was ousted in some move in which Museveni then became the local viceroy. And, I don't know quite how that ended and how he came back to power. But Museveni has also served as the sheriff. Ugandan troops served in Iraq. I believe they also served in Afghanistan, all over the continent. Both Ugandan and Rwandan and previously Ethiopian troops were deployed in service to the US agenda. So now the Congo you wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
That's gone into a new phase that's really alarming. And I think there are two things to say about that. One is that there's this constant hysteria about fake Islamists.
Oh, I did not hear about that. Okay, yeah.
Okay, they keep saying you can find these headlines. If you start looking for them, you'll find headlines about ISIS in the Congo. And that was what they said was going on in, I think it's Mozambique as well, where the Rwandan troops went to protect the gas fields. This is totally implausible in Congo. It is a 95% Christian country, maybe even more. The Muslim population is 1%, something like that. How are they going to get any traction? How is ISIS going to get any traction in the Democratic Republic of the Congo? There was an Islamic group in Uganda that crossed the border into the Congo at one point when they were having a conflict with the Ugandan government. They had been gone, no sight of them for many years, when suddenly this story popped up that the Allied Democratic Forces, this Islamic militia, fundamentalist Islamic militia, had reemerged. I don't know if they ever even acknowledged that they disappeared, but suddenly they became the bad guys. And all of the violence in the Kivus now is blamed on them. It's a totally implausible story. And what you have going on really is the Rwandan and Ugandan colonization of the Kivus, which has actually been going on since the Congo War started, first in 1996 and then 1998.
Yeah, after the overthrow of Mobutu Sese Seko.
Yeah,
because he had outlived his usefulness, and he did not want Rwandan refugees. In other words, he did not want Kagame and his proxies to come into his country, and then later, that led to his overthrow. Kabila being a puppet. Kabila was later then murdered by Rwanda and Uganda, replaced by Kabila Jr. And now I think Kabila Jr. sort of has outlived his usefulness, right?
Oh, I think he's still pulling a lot of strings, but it's always been the Congo Wars. And since have been about plundering the resources of Eastern Congo. And the new phase deals between Rwanda and Congo, between Kagame and Felix Tshisekedi, and the building of an infrastructure, like real roads, to remove the resources of the Eastern Congo. This is the new phase. It's just becoming accepted. This is something I need to do some studying about more. People, my Congolese friends have been telling me about it, and I've been paying so much attention to Ethiopia that I haven't had as much time as I would like to understand it, but it's sort of on my list as one of the things I need to learn more about next.
Well, certainly, Black Agenda Report readers and listeners will be looking forward to when you uncover the latest thing that's happening in Congo. But
I have a Japanese economist friend whom I need to interview, who's very knowledgeable about that. Geez, I should say, since you mentioned refugees, and since we're having a freewheeling conversation, I have to say that it wasn't the refugees that Mobutu minded, the Rwandan refugees who flooded into Congo and every other direction, but more into Congo than any place else at the end of the Rwandan genocide. What Mobutu didn't want was the Rwandan and Ugandan armies coming in and chasing them across the Congo until he was assassinated. And then Kabila I did not want them to stay. In fact, at one point he said, well, okay, they can stay, but they came here as conquerors. They can stay, but they can't rule. And then that Kabila was gone.
Wow, thanks so much for clarifying that. No, I mean, it's very, yeah, no.
And at one point, James Kabarebe, who I think, I'm not sure if he's still Kagame's army chief of staff, but at one point he was the commander of the Congolese army.
Unbelievable. That's just unbelievable. And then I think sort of my second to last question is when we talk about Rwanda, what do people really need to understand about Kagame and what the West knowingly allowed him to do after the supposed Rwandan genocide and his reign of terror, not just in Rwanda, but Congo?
Let me recommend a couple of books. One is How Paul Kagame Deliberately Sacrificed the Tutsi. The Tutsi genocide gave Kagame an excuse to rule as a minority dictatorship. This is also heavily evidenced in Judy Reaver's book, In Praise of Blood, Crimes of the Rwandan Patriotic Front.
Fantastic book.
Yeah, isn't it? Yeah, and then in 1996, Uganda and Rwanda invaded DRC and overthrew Mobutu. And then, as you know, the Kabila I didn't work out. They invaded again in 1998. And there's been constant plunder in the Eastern DRC since. In Judy Reaver's book, she said she talked to one of these kind of consultant types who is an expert in the region who didn't want to be named. And he said that the West had planned to create a Tutsi elite to manage the resources of Central Africa for them. Most of all, those, of course, of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And that's just not, well, I don't like to dwell on ethnicity, but okay. Museveni, it's not really widely known, but Museveni is some branch of the Tutsi. He grew up in southern Uganda on the border of Rwanda.
Ah, okay, interesting.
Okay, and so this was that somehow they had chosen the Tutsi as an appropriate managerial elite. And of course, Museveni and Kagame have benefited hugely. At one point,
and then very quickly, because I always get confused with with Rwanda and Burundi and their different tribes. Kagame's part of the Tutsis or the
Kagame's Tutsi.
Okay,
Tutsis.
yes.
Yeah, that's why. So how Paul Kagame deliberately sacrificed the Tutsi. And he sacrificed the Tutsi who had, this gets complicated, the Tutsi who were still in Rwanda at the time of the Hutu power revolution. The Tutsi had oppressed the Hutu for many years in a feudal system, basically. At the time of the Hutu power revolution, a lot of the aristocratic Tutsi fled, particularly into Uganda, and they eventually regrouped and reinvaded with US backing. And in fact, I'm on my way tomorrow to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. I'm doing some research for a Japanese academic at a Japanese university whom I've worked with on various things, to see what kind of evidence we can find in that library of top officials during the Reagan administration, that would be in the 80s, planning this. And she discussed that some in her book, which I reviewed, which is about Rwandan refugees, about the UNHCR and the US abuse of the millions of Rwandan refugees who flooded across the border into DRC. The UNHCR, the UN High Commission for Refugees, has always been a close ally of the Kagame regime. And a lot of the UN agencies are highly politicized like this. One thing you learn about the UN agencies, if you look into it, is that they're not funded by the UN general budget. They're funded by Western governments primarily. So they have the name UN in front of them, which makes it sound, I always assumed they were funded by some general UN budget. Yeah. No, they're funded by Western governments and big foundations like the Gates Foundation. But I've gotten off track here. You asked me how that happened, about what's happened to the Congo. What's happened to the Congo since, the Congo is the worst situation I know of. It's just constantly heartbreaking. And
so the reason why Kagame has managed to get away with all that is because of the fact that you were saying that for years in the making, it didn't even just start with Clinton, but for years in the making, the West were definitely planning this, and of course he had the backing of the UN because I know when talking with Eve Engler that Romeo Dallaire actually was actually was working with Kagame into these are where your enemies are. This is where you need to do the slaughter, and he basically helped whitewash Kagame, props him up as the hero of Rwanda, while completely suppressing what Kagame is what Kagame and Uganda, as you mentioned, is doing in DRC.
Well, and Kagame's image is now badly tarnished. He used to be like a savior. He was treated as the savior, the man who saved Rwanda and lifted it from the ashes. Yeah. He's severely tarnished, but they still need him and use him. And he implies that if they ever tried to take him, oops, my phone.
No problem.
If they tried to take him to the ICC, he was going to start talking and keep talking. He made that quite clear.
Interesting. Wow, that's
and he's made various asides since then. Just a second, let me do this. Frank, I'll call you right back. Sorry, I'll call you right back.
Well, don't worry, we're almost done. We're almost done. Okay. But it is amazing the evil that the Western powers should have inflicted on Africa, and Kagame is just Yeah, that just takes like, that evil. It's like a whole nother level, especially, especially, with like Mobutu, like you think, geez, all these years of service I did for you guys, and this is how you repay me.
This is how, and he says, don't tell me Abiy Ahmed is a dictator. You've been behind these guys, Kagame and Museveni, for decades.
Unbelievable.
It seems obvious to like you and me, but Africa is to a lot of people, it's still the dark continent, and just understanding anything about it is too difficult.
Yeah. I mean, at times, like, I can understand why, why some people would be confused about Africa, but then again, that's only because the corporate media deliberately avoids talking about Africa. And then the more you start, sort of digging into it, the more you realize, well, actually, it's not so complicated. It's just, it's just, divide and conquer. It's a new scramble, and the powers to be, if they'll, the powers to be, if they use half truths to get what they want, they're going to use half truths. And it's going to be full on fake news. It's going to be full on fake news, right?
Well, it's certainly no more complicated than the Middle East. Not in the least, but people haven't paid as much attention to it in the West, and the anti-war movement, insofar as it still exists, hasn't focused on it much because there aren't any big bombs falling out of the sky, because it's proxy war. US soldiers aren't dying, European soldiers aren't dying, and the big bombs aren't dropping.
And NGOs are making the big killing.
And NGOs are making a killing, yes. Yes. Another thing to understand about aid is that it's really big business.
Yep, exactly. And then we see a country like Haiti where it's the republic of where it's the republic of NGOs. So when a good guy like Aristide comes in, and he's going to take power away from the NGOs, and is actually going to empower the people. So therefore, all the NGOs then were supported a brutal coup against him and so forth. So it's just unbelievable.
So there's somebody, a good friend of mine, who is a really fundamentally good guy and so forth, who knows what I take interest in, said to me once, "You should work for an agency." And I just said, whoa, oh, no. The last thing I would want to be is involved in NGO aggression in Africa, which some people say is even worse than AFRICOM or any other sort of military aggression.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I used to once upon a time want to work for an NGO, and sure, I mean, I wouldn't mind the salaries, that the big guys make, but once you start thinking to NGOs, you realize, no, there's no way I'm going to be a partner in crime to the suppression of Africans, Haitians, or any other. Mm-hmm. Well, we're almost getting to the end, and before I let you go, Miss Garrison, I usually always end the show now with this very quick questionnaire, which is the Marcel Proust Bernard Pivot questionnaire that my hero James Lipton would do for Inside the Actors Studio. So before closing, Miss Garrison, what is your favorite word?
Words.
Word. Favorite word.
Word.
Yeah.
Well, at the moment, with regard to everything that we've been talking about, sovereignty.
Oh, that's a great one. What's your least favorite words?
Charity.
What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
Revolution.
What turns you off?
Imperial aggression.
Imperial aggression. What is your favorite curse words?
Oh, well, I'm just kind of, I'm just kind of run of the mill. I think I prefer the F word.
Fantastic. And what sound or noise do you love?
What?
What sound or noise do you love?
That's interesting. I like listening to my cats meow.
What sound or noise do you hate?
Leaf blowers.
Oh, yes. Yeah, they are dreadful things. And what profession other than yours would you like to attempt?
Well, I don't think I'm going to attempt a new one at this point, but sometimes if I look back, I think I might have liked to be a public defender.
Public defender, okay.
I attended a trial of a Rwandan refugee who was, on trial for lying about his immigration papers in Boston a couple of years ago. I was reporting on that. And this is the way that Kagame goes after people when someone's doing too well, or he wants them deported, somebody who is too effective in talking about what the Rwandan government is really like Paul Rusesabagina.
Yeah.
He'll go after them in one way or another, and one way is to manufacture a case that they were guilty of genocide during the Rwandan genocide, and that they lied on their papers. They lied about it on their papers to get into this country. Like they didn't write on their immigration papers, I participated in the Rwandan genocide. And anyway, I was very engaged by this trial, and it made me think, well, in another life, I might be a public defender.
And what profession would you absolutely not like to do under any circumstances?
I know I'm supposed to say being a sanitation worker, but I can think of cop. I wouldn't want to be a cop.
And my final one, if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
Come on in.
All righty. Well, Ms. Garrison, thank you so much for joining me on this edition of 1+1. It was a real, it'd be an honor to have you back in the future and have you as a regular. Keep doing the incredible work you're doing, especially on Congo, Rwanda, and its neighbor, Burundi and Uganda. Folks, check out Ann Garrison at Black Agenda Reports. Subscribe and donate generously if you can. And of course, donate generously to the Black Alliance for Peace and join and join them in the US Out of Africa and Africa campaign. And also join and donate generously to the Friends of Congo. Check out, I'll also be posting Miss Garrison's SoundCloud, and you're also part of of a group, Rescue Pacifica. Is that still going on, or?
Oh man, I'm really impressed. You've heard of Rescue Pacifica across the Atlantic Ocean?
Yep.
Wow. Who told you about
and is that still happening? Because I had Daniel Borgstrom on a long time ago in an early episode talking about that.
Oh yeah, he's a very good friend of mine. And in fact, this person who was just calling me is not only a member of Rescue Pacifica, but he's also the subject of this piece I'm working on for Black Agenda Report this week. He got knocked to the ground and roughed up and arrested in a neighboring city here because he was at the goodbye party for the former police chief, who happened to be the first Black police chief in the city of Antioch. And he and Frank and some other protesters were there holding up signs and saying that he was actually not a great police chief, that he had been involved in various kinds of police brutality, he had condoned it, and that Boise, he was going off to be the police chief in Boise, Idaho, they should know what they were getting. So I should go call him back about that.
Well, and I'll make sure to post a link then to I'll make sure to also post a link to that organization, which is trying to stop the right-wing shift and Pacifica Radio jumping the shark on so many issues, which they need to be, anti-imperialist consistently, defend Assange unconditionally, and more. And of course, Ms. Garrison also got an award named after the incredible Victoire Ingabire. I hope I'm not pronouncing her name. One of many people Kagame has tried to silence and intimidate. So, Ms. Garrison, thank you.
Wait, excuse me, just 1 second. I don't have my own SoundCloud page. I post to the Pacifica Radio SoundCloud page, which is what I did today. But I also have a YouTube channel. My YouTube channel is just Ann Garrison, and boy, we've been talking so long, I'm hoarse. It would really help me out. I would really appreciate it if anyone who went to my YouTube channel and liked what they saw would subscribe.
Make sure to send me the links, and I'll make sure to post that in the pinned comment section. So, Ms. Garrison, thank you so much for joining me on Black History Month, and again, keep doing the incredible work you're doing at Black Agenda Report. You give my best to Margaret, Danny Haifong, and the team there. And again, I encourage everyone to get this book by the late, great Glen Ford, and rest in power to both him and Bruce Dixon. And you're continuing on the fantastic work that they're doing. So,
okay, so long.
Thank you. Ciao till then.